welcome back to Seattle Sucks, a podcast about hating the city we love. We are back on the boat. The whole normal crew is here, but we're here with a special guest. Brian, I'm going to let you do the honors. Can you introduce our guest, please?
Oh, yes. I met this guy many years ago. Respected his ginger energy.
There's a lot of ginger energy on this boat right now. A lot of ginger beards right now.
And ginger drinks, too.
But this is my good friend, and I think we decided official sanctioned historian, Dr. Kevin McKenna.
Thank you, Brian.
No, you didn't tell me we were having a doctor of philosophy aboard.
Doctor of philosophy, huh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's a doctor of medicine. Kevin teaches high school locally and just got his PhD from the University of Washington. And thought we'd have him on, ask for medical advice.
So we're all gonna die tonight.
Yeah, basically. Hey, Kevin has more medical afflictions than I've met now, like the time allergy. I feel like we've had some time close calls.
Oh, yikes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you did tell me that, and I was, like, furiously scanning the list of ingredients.
Well, we had Thanksgiving.
How did that make it into my bio?
You told me this like 3 times, and I was planning to buy food for tonight if I had not been working like 14 hours. And it had totally left my mind. Just absolutely gone.
Well, the funny thing is, I've had Thanksgiving with Kevin like many times, and trying to make a Thanksgiving food item without thyme in it. Let me tell you what. There's one ingredient that is in every Thanksgiving food item. And that's fucking thyme, and you kind of notice if it's not that. It's delicious, Kevin. Like you are missing out. Like it's so good. It's so good. But
If you concentrated it, it smells absolutely evil.
Yeah, it is a little funky. But, yeah.
I don't know, but
It gives me the hives, so...
Yeah. There's been some close calls, to be sure. I think maybe the first time I learned that you were allergic to thyme was you were... I'm doing Greg's like, wasting time.
Yeah.
But I think we were doing a Thanksgiving, and I made the stuffing, and I think you were, like, eating it while you were asking me if I had thyme in it. I was like, yeah, absolutely, it's stuffing. But yeah, so, anyways. So... Kevin studies the history of gay Seattle. Is that fair to say?
Sure, gay politics in Seattle in particular. More the history of the gay movement in Seattle, or the gay movements, I should say, and how that intersects with city politics. Not so much the social and cultural history.
Yeah, and I think... we were talking a little bit earlier about the Pride in 2017 and the Pride Parade in 2017. And I think I was mentioning that me and my girlfriend were over by the Seattle Center side of the Pride March, like the very end of it. And it was such a weird year because, Trump had just gotten elected. And he had just dropped the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan.
Awesome.
And, yeah, awesome, yeah. And, at the front of the Pride March was, some, companies or corporations. But there was also, a military, group going through about, gays in the military and just being we just dropped an enormous bomb on Afghanistan. I don't know, now's the time to be, cheering for the military. And a move that was just purely done to, boost a shitty president's fucking approval rating for a second. And similarly, they're also immediately following the military, of course, was Seattle PD and their rainbow cars and stuff like that. And that was
They had rainbow cars?
Yeah, it's a fucking whole thing they do every year.
But didn't you have an epic tweet about the Moab?
Oh, in the Moab, I had tweeted that gays in the military, great. I'm sure there were no gay people under the Moab when it dropped on Afghanistan. You got 10,000 people. I'm sure none of them were gay.
It's weird. Wars kill people.
Yeah. And what a cool thing to celebrate. Because the American military doing great things abroad. But when the police came by, this was the height of the police at CLPD had just killed Charlene Lyles.
1 week to the day before the
fair,
parade.
they've always just killed
someone. Yeah.
So
Seems like it, and
you could throw a dart at a calendar.
Yeah, and people were definitely not in a pro SPD mood, because I remember SPD on Twitter, their official account, had posted a thing that was like, SPD at Pride, let us know how we can make your Pride better. And literally everybody just responded like, you could stop like killing black people. Like that would make everybody's day better. But so while the march is happening, like SPD went by, and I think they literally were the last ones who went by, and there was like just nothing. Like, and everybody's getting like antsy in their pantsy because, they think that, there's supposed to be more march, and they're like getting upset. And it slowly comes out that there is a protest up the ways of the march, right, that is protesting SPD. And let's just say, at least in the area I was standing, people were not thrilled. But Kevin, maybe you can inform us a little about like what was going on at the...
Sure, yeah. It was a No Justice, No Pride action led by young queer people of color who sat down in the middle of the street to stop the parade, to raise attention to Charlene Lyles, who had just been murdered in police brutality and Black Lives Matter more generally. And while that was happening, I think the parade stopped for half an hour or so, maybe even a little bit less. But while they were doing that, they were able to get on the loudspeakers and give a history of the Stonewall riots, which we are about to celebrate the 50th anniversary of in a few weeks here, which was led by trans people of color, and other, the Stonewall Inn, aside from just being a gay bar, was a bar that was welcoming to working class people, trans people of color. It was a bar that the most marginalized in New York City were welcome at. And so it's not coincidental that this is a bar that the New York Police Department decides to raid in late June of 1969. That history, which is what the parade is commemorating, Seattle Pride always coincides with the anniversary of Stonewall, was a really important intervention in this parade that has become, as Brian mentioned, more or less a rainbow capitalist parade.
Yeah, I thought it was commemorating good times, but gay.
Well, like, maybe for all, like, the dumb straight guys, definitely not in this boat. The Stonewall, so the Stonewall Inn is in New York, right? And it's bringing a clientele that is, we'll just say, low income. And,
a very diverse crowd.
And NYPD, like, why is NYPD there?
So this was routine, not just in New York City, but in most American cities. Seattle was somewhat of an exception, which I can talk about. But this was in the post World War II. During World War II, the U.S. military literally screened everyone for homosexuality, which ironically fostered these ginormous gay communities in places like New York and San Francisco, and other places that a lot of military personnel moved in and out of, and people who probably never had even thought of themselves as such because of this screening that they went through were now exposed to this idea of being gay.
Yeah. Well,
and then when they got discharged, they knew exactly where to go.
So what was the screening where they just feeling like the bumps on their heads? This one's Italian. This one's gay.
Yeah, they would just ask them straight up, like, do you have sex with men? And then, but also if men acted too effeminate, the assumption was that they were gay and they would be excluded from the military, which, good for them, not having to go to World War II.
Yeah.
Or would get discharged along the way, dishonorably discharged.
Yeah.
So
they missed out on the Freedom War in Korea. That was their mistake.
So that's the dawn of that kind of anxiety around sexuality in the U.S. military that, continues. Now we're dealing with anxiety around trans people in the military.
Yeah. And this led to, like, people in gay communities being kind of, concentrated in some of these urban areas,
Exactly.
like in New York City.
Exactly. World War I played some role, but World War II really blew it up.
Yeah.
So,
the police just like shaking them down in these bars because like nobody has sympathy for them.
Yeah. So, in a lot of
like,
these places, it was not just police brutality, but it was extortion at the same time. So there, police could there were no protections from getting fired from your job. Cross-dressing in New York City was illegal. So you could literally be thrown in jail for wearing clothing that did not match your genitalia.
Well, there goes the theater. they cross-dressing a critical element of fucking production.
And what's really interesting about that is New York had a very open drag performance. This is things that straight people would go to in the 1920s. And then Fiorello LaGuardia came in as mayor, and he's of course touted as this progressive mayor of New York City. And the police immediately put the hush-hush on all of that.
It's interesting. A progressive mayor engaged in some anti-LGBTQ activities. Well, maybe this probably won't ever come up again. So they're shaking them down at the club, and then what the people at the bar do?
So that night at Stonewall, so this happened pretty routinely, and Stonewall was not the first reaction to an instance of police brutality. In fact, something on a similar scale had happened in San Francisco, New Year's Eve going into New Year's Day, 1965. But for whatever reason, Stonewall caught on as this. People kind of latched onto Stonewall as a birthing moment of this new radical movement, where gay men and lesbians were, and trans folks were not going to take it anymore. So the rumblings had been there, and other forms of gay activism had also taken hold as well that looked different, that were much more about acceptance as being normal people. This is referred to as the homophile movement. But many people point to Stonewall as the birth of gay liberation, even though the groundwork was being laid well before Stonewall.
Yeah, there's never a moment, right, where a thing comes into birth. But, people latch on. Something captures the imagination.
Exactly.
Or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. And it certainly caught the imagination of gay folks in Seattle, who continued to celebrate Pride that same weekend, and San Francisco and Chicago, all those cities, and New York City, obviously.
So Stonewall happens. So how do we get to Pride from Stonewall, right?
The earliest Prides happened in cities that had these big visible gay populations, of which Seattle was one. One reason Seattle was one, perhaps disproportionately to its size, is that Seattle didn't have the same kind of police brutality that other cities had. And, that word got out, probably even to some folks in San Francisco especially. But they did extort gay bar owners.
Yeah. Well, police will police.
Right. So, the gay bar owners paid for many, many years. And there was one instance in 1958 where the police did raid a bar, and it was a disruption of that status quo of the bars being left alone, that people threatened to throw these policemen under the bus and expose the whole thing. And so the system went right back into existence how it had been until around 1970, when a couple gay bar owners decided that they'd had enough of that. The irony of this is, so during that time, if you were not a bar owner and were just a random gay or lesbian person or someone exploring your sexual identity at these bars down in Pioneer Square, you had a high degree of freedom once you were inside that door. And sometimes police would even help prevent straight people from entering those spaces, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And, some of the sources I looked at, detail, with police being present and fully knowing that this was going on, sexual activity happening on the dance floor.
Oh my.
Yeah. It was and underage kids getting into these spaces. It was really anything goes. They were getting paid, overtime through the payoff system, so they didn't give a fuck.
Yeah. The good old days of old police corruption.
Yeah, exactly. But then once that cover was blown in 1970, then Wes Ullman, who had recently become mayor, decided to bring in someone with a reputation for reforming the police department, which means meant more aggressive policing and especially more policing of victimless crimes. More raiding of gay bars, and also crackdown on prostitution and gambling and all of those kinds of things. And that lasted a few years, and then gay people in Seattle found their voice and really mobilized against this police chief, George Teal'c. And in that process of fighting this what was in Seattle really a new form of police brutality, Seattle became the first city of its size to pass non-discrimination protections in employment for gay men and lesbians in 1973. San Francisco had done it just for municipal employees, but Seattle did it as a citywide ordinance that included private employers.
Yeah.
This was a result of activism coming out of starting out of these gay clubs.
Yeah, pretty much. And this was, this is post Stonewall, so this comes from radical activism. These are folks who are in the streets, being their queer selves, not trying to portray themselves as normal, but commanding respect for their humanity on their own terms.
What is it? I mean, is it safe to say, given it's like 1969, 1970, 71, right? These are people who probably had some foot in like civil rights actions.
I mean,
and,
yes,
anti-war stuff. Right?
This is
people, there's some groundwork for
absolutely,
a movement,
yeah,
right?
Anti-war movement. This is generally that generation, the baby boomer generation. And this is, of course, on the heels of Black Power as well. Gay Power was one of the slogans. It was radical activism that got that on the map. And Seattle probably benefited from having a fairly young mayor who was perhaps more receptive to that than in a lot of other American cities. He himself I think he was close to 30 years old when he was elected. So that's where Seattle's reputation as this gay-friendly town begins, really, in 1973 with that employment ordinance.
Yeah. Well, if you were to go to, like, a pride parade in 1973 or 74 or whatever, what would it look like?
There was not even a parade then.
Yeah.
So the earliest gay pride celebrations in Seattle in the early 70s, they were held at Seattle Center, actually. The idea was, let's get people out in public, visibly in public, and there's pictures of naked gay men and lesbians jumping around in the fountain at Seattle Center from 1974 that I've seen. It then became a march. They did not call it a parade. So they marched from roughly from Pioneer Square down 3rd or 4th Avenue through the middle of downtown Seattle.
Yeah, because Pioneer Square is like the gay neighborhood at this point.
Yeah,
right?
so that's where the bars are. So
Yeah.
And the reason they're there is because respectable white middle class people did not touch Pioneer Square with a 10-foot pole back in those days.
Yeah.
This was where
That's only changed pretty recently.
yeah. So there was
Yeah.
a large homeless population, a lot of very visible prostitution, single resident occupancy hotels that transient workers lived in temporarily, and generally very non-white. Very much a place where, there were jazz clubs, there were Native Americans, there were Asian folks. It's right next to the ID.
Yeah, and traditionally, like, redlined neighborhoods, right, where, like, Asian and black populations are trapped, essentially in these neighborhoods, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this was a place where white middle-class gay men and lesbians could go without the fear of running into anybody that they knew, other than their, gay friends. The gay liberation movement changes that as this becomes more visible, as policing becomes more common. It was very common all over the country when these police raids happened for people's names to be published in newspapers, and would lose their jobs generally. Sometimes lose their housing.
So they would like raid a bar and then just put your fucking name in the paper,
And just put
like
it
on
all,
a blotter.
put it on fucking blast. Yeah.
Yeah, fuck it.
You know, your family could disown you. I mean, there were very serious consequences that could happen from having your identity found out.
So this is like the first case of doxing, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I never thought about it that way, but yeah, pretty much.
Always a right-wing tool. Cool.
Yeah.
So, up to 2017, right? We're not on a march now. We're on a parade.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to guess that maybe the issues that were front and center at the 2017 parade, at least from the official, parade itself, were maybe a hair different than they were in 75.
Right. So, the march was for just basic rights.
Mm-hmm.
There were the employment protections in 73, but housing protections barely passed, 5-4 in the city council in 75. And in 75 is when you start getting more moderate voices that become more prominent. So, and many of them, started in the homophile movement. Many others only were able to come out because of gay liberation, and then in many ways shifted the focus to this: I'm gay, but I'm still white middle class.
Which from your dissertation you called heteronormativity, right?
Yeah. So heteronormativity is a term coined by Lisa Dugan to describe this exact kind of politics and gay folks who tend to fall into white heteronormative ways of being. Married, single family home, consumers.
Yeah. What it seems like maybe like the parallel is in the sort of feminist movement that had these like radical leanings in the late 60s, early 70s. But by the 80s and certainly by today, it just boiled down to, how come there aren't more women CEOs, right? Like it was just a promotional program for the already wealthy.
Yeah, no, that's a very good parallel. And feminism and gay liberation parallel each other very closely.
Yeah.
And lesbian feminism, it's worth pointing out, was, this was a time where, women were asserting themselves and their identities, and lesbian feminists very often had their own activism that was very separate from gay men. They wrote gay men off as, and in some ways, correctly, as misogynist.
Gay but still men.
As misogynists and tools of the patriarchy and whatnot. So,
but you touch on that too in your dissertation that that gay men did have a lot of privilege because they were still men, and if they were white, they had even more power. And that's something else that I wanted to ask you about was this concept of sex blindness, which I thought was really interesting because it feels like all of these liberal ideas are really about passing as normal, and so I'd love to hear more about sex blindness.
Yeah, so I came up with that term. Really, it's an outgrowth of color blindness, which folks like Michelle Alexander and others have used as a framework to write about this, as really what Brian was talking about, this shift from what radical movements in the 60s and 70s were really arguing for, which was like a restructuring of society to be truly inclusive and equitable, toward this token kind of inclusion of, well, as long as we get a few of them up there in the top whatever percent, then that's inclusion. And so, we see that with colorblindness, with, Supreme Court decisions that strip away at race-conscious tools that are meant to create a more equitable society. And you see that also with the politics of moderate gay men and lesbians who are essentially arguing for it not being their identity, their sexual identity of not being something remarkable.
Right.
Of just being a normal person,
Yeah.
which in the society we live in is, of course, the subtext is white middle class.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, heterosexual.
Yeah.
Well, maybe in that context, we can talk about this. So there's this thing in 1995, right, where there's an acceptance in Seattle of, they call it domestic partnerships, right? And then seemingly right after it, they start closing all the parks at night. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about that to kind of show how this sex by just works in practice.
Yeah, yes. One of the most fascinating thing that didn't expect to find and found when I was doing my research. So, in the early 90s, there was a push, very simultaneous and even involving a lot of the same actors, which is really fascinating. And I don't know that they thought of the two issues in relation to one another at all, but when you think about them together, it's really the inclusion of the gay couple and the exclusion of any sort of visible public sexuality. So by 1994, Seattle has domestic partnership recognition available for everyone, which is completely symbolic. The city had tried to actually have a real domestic partnership program where city employees could actually get their partner's benefits. And then because of federal law, they were unable to do that. So it's truly symbolic. It is rainbow washing.
Yeah.
Or pink washing.
Yeah.
And as that's happening, first in Volunteer Park on North Capitol Hill in the early 90s, the, quote, Friends of Volunteer Park, which are generally the very wealthy white folks that live right around the park.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever been there, you know what I'm talking about. There's giant mansions, pretty much in every direction from there. So, and, generally speaking, these are people who have a lot of time on their hands because they are housewives or they...
Well, the rich people.
Exactly. Or they make money and,
when other people
volunteer
labor
in their
for
spare
you.
time. Yeah. Yes, volunteer, and they literally refer to Volunteer Park as their backyard. So,
And they have, when you have money, you have power. You have people take your phone calls.
Oh, yeah.
You make a stink. You don't have to have a march.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got your city council person, you just call right up. So, so they start pushing, and the city resists this for some time. But ultimately, Volunteer Park is the first park that has hours. You used to just be able to hang out in a public park whenever. And the assumption was it's a public park. If you want to go for a walk at 3 a.m.
Yeah, you're part of the public, right?
Exactly. And even a lot of folks who maybe opposed some of these sexual activity or realistically drug use was probably part of it. Sex was what is literally in the written record, which is fascinating, but other cities are doing the same thing in the 90s and just it's about drugs and homelessness, and there's no airs about that. My hunch is that's at play as well, but sex becomes something that I guess is more palatable to be against.
Well, interesting. Maybe so Capitol Hill's kind of become the gay neighborhood at this point, or maybe it's moved out of Pioneer Square and kind of up the hill at this point. So why are people having sex in the park? I guess.
Yeah, so...
Why not in their homes? In those mansions?
Well, definitely not having sex in those mansions. That's nothing to do with that.
So I'm confused. You mentioned that there are all these mansions around Volunteer Park whose backyard is, in fact, that park.
No.
Why are the people having sex in the park and not in their homes?
So these
Is
are
this
not
just a fetish of these people?
not the people in the mansions, generally speaking, but
so somebody's in the mansion people's backyard.
So there's a combination of things at play here. So there are there are people who just like cruising. They like the idea of like sneaking around a bush and whatever. Also, there are people who are not gay identified. Who this is a place where they can meet people for sex without going into a bathhouse or otherwise outing themselves to
It's
anyone.
literally dark and at night.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and certainly in the early 90s, a lot of people can't just bring their boyfriend home, right? You know, because they're
Oh, yes. Also that, yes. Like, if you live with your family, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, and also Volunteer Park back in those days had these basically, like, giant tree tents that so it wasn't even... You know, it wasn't like you were walking through the park and there were just dudes fucking everywhere. Like, you know.
This isn't Berlin, all right?
And it's fascinating to read. There's a lot of commentary in Seattle Gay News around this while this is a conversation. And there's some of the... There was one of the articles editorials I came across was written by a lesbian who was all in favor of this. She's like, if we start closing this down, you know, basically saying this is like a step towards fascism if we close these parks overnight, and basically like who gives a fuck if dudes are fucking in bushes.
Yeah.
You know,
probably a reasonable
another
response.
person wrote in and basically said just like, don't leave your dirty fucking condoms lying around everywhere, and like maybe that'll save this from happening.
Sure.
This is of course during the AIDS epidemic, though Seattle is public health response to AIDS is more robust than really any other American city, so you don't see the fear of AIDS really come up in these conversations because Seattle is a city that is by and large educated about AIDS in a way that a lot of other places aren't. But Volunteer Park does end up getting closed overnight, and then in the summer of '94, literally as Domestic Partnership is happening, the North Precinct in Seattle is literally entrapping men in Woodland Park into sex.
Like pretending like they're
like
cruising,
undercover cops,
and then
exactly.
arresting. And under what what would they charge? Like what were they claiming they were up to? Just public lewdness, or
right? Yeah.
So just hitting with like the most bullshit of like tiny crimes.
Right. Exactly. Again, victimless crimes. So we're back really to the George Teal'c days. And then at that point, rather than be like, okay, now we're going to close Woodland Park, they just blanket closed every park in Seattle. At that time, it was between 11 and 4. I think now they've extended those hours from 10 to 6, which in the summer, as you know, is like, it's not even dark at 10, or certainly at 6, the sun is already up. So, and then that becomes not just a gay problem, but for folks that are homeless, or that becomes a way for the police to arrest people in public space, regardless of what they're doing there.
Well, it seems like an assertion of the right. So if we think about Volunteer Park, of the mansion people, it's an assertion that's saying that this is your backyard. Actually, like their rights are being asserted over the rights of lesser people.
Yeah, this quote-unquote public space, is being recognized as this private backyard for these folks. Yes.
Yeah, that they can call the shots on or whatever.
Right.
So for the sort of stand-up gay community of like white businessmen, what's their take on the park situation?
So at this point in time, there is a... Actually, really, by that time, they already have the Seattle Gay and Lesbian Commission, I think it was called at the time. It's now the LGBT, they've maybe added a Q now, commission.
Little steps.
Yeah, so first there was just a Mayor's Gay and Lesbian Task Force, which was formed at the height of the AIDS epidemic, which only advised the mayor. As a commission, it advises the council and the mayor. And the people tapped to be on it, which are all chosen by the city council and the mayor, in those days were people generally from that cohort of moderate gay politics, and so there were even some. Interestingly, Ed Murray is one of these people.
Luckily, he never comes up in the news again. Well, luckily, he never engaged in abnormal sex acts that wouldn't be
I was
approved
hoping
of
I'd be the first to drop Ed Murray's name.
But Ed Murray is a spokesperson. I think he's the head of this thing. It might have still been the mayor's gay task force in the early 90s when he was on it. And he's resistant of it and making this argument that you're ruining fathers' lives who need this park to have basically cheat on their wives with dudes.
That's honestly...
Wow, that's some galaxy brain shit right there.
Well, but also if Ed Murray, if that was like, if he had posted that everywhere when he was running as mayor, I would have fucking voted for him. That fucking rules.
But that sort of is a sum up, right? Because he's like, it's identifying like who the important victim is here is some kind of
closeted men or
like
straight identifying men. Yeah.
Someone with a home and a family, a middle class.
Right. Yes.
Like,
Yeah. Family politics is central to the argument.
Yeah, and sort of like establishing, in and out groups, right? Of this is acceptable behavior, which is a domestic partnership, I guess, which models a married, a nuclear family, and the non-acceptable behavior of, largely groups that are marginalized already, right? I mean, if you're having sex in a park for the most part, you're probably not, doing great in the city,
It seems like the progression of this kind of viewpoint is like from in that it's like Ed Murray says, like an acceptable homosexual who is closeted and living like a heteronormative life in one sense, in that they have a wife and children, but it needs to be okay for them to be gay. Which seems like a very small, not very radical ask. And then that has since then, moved just a little ways into... It seems like that the next step from that is being out and gay, but still living that heteronormative life. Like, they seem very connected to me.
Yes, exactly. You can see the argument for domestic partnership embedded in that argument against closing the parks, even there. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I get to present on this at the first ever Queer History Conference in a week or two. So.
When is that?
It's in San Francisco, June 16th to 18th.
Awesome.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
So jump forward. Barack Obama and Ed Murray, hand in hand, make it okay to be gay.
They also end racism, too, which is convenient as well.
Well, throw in the Supreme Court with that, too.
Yeah.
Well, interesting, was there a gay mayor before Ed Murray? Is it Ed Murray and then Durkin just back to back?
In Seattle, it's Murray and Durkin, yeah.
So we basically, we reached the sort of heights of colorblindness when Obama gets elected and racism is extinguished from the earth, only to be reintroduced by Moscow years later. But Ed Murray and then, of course, Jay Durkin, who's lesbian, get elected in Seattle, and this has now changed the formula for the LGBTQ community in Seattle, who are now perfectly liberated and on an equal footing with everyone else. So it's kind of like a short story for us. Yeah, we did it. We won, guys.
Not exactly.
What's important is who did it, and that is elected Democrats.
Ed Murray. Yes, Ed Murray single-handedly.
Yes, I mean, as we can... I mean, the story keeps writing its fucking self. It's kind of... it's not unreal, because it's, it's real and it's perhaps hyper-real. But with, both certainly, I mean, right now we can see with Jenny Durkin and her approach to homelessness in Seattle, that politics of domestic partnership combined with closing parks overnight is still happening.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, she'll close some parks, right? Yeah. Well, she definitely has an idea of like whose city it is, right? Yeah, I mean, she's sort of the embodiment of that. Well, and Ed Murray. I mean, the interesting thing about Ed Murray, he ends up getting taken down. He's a very popular with the business community mayor who gets taken down by a sex scandal, right?
Yeah.
You know, that whether you approve of Ed Murray's sex life or not, I mean, they essentially just write him out as like he's not the loving house husband that we thought he was, or some shit like that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing, too, is a lot of the people fighting for domestic partnership themselves have very queer relationships.
Mm-hmm.
You know, their public face is different than their private life.
Yeah.
But, yes, I mean, and, you know, of course, Jenny Durkin stands by Ed Murray through a number of now men who accused him of molesting them, and she stands by his side until his own cousin throws his name in the ring, and then she's like, oh, these claims must actually be true.
Well, they at least have reached a point where it's I don't know that, you know, not to put any words in Jenny Durkin's mouth. I don't know that she's ever cared about whether things are true or not. I think it's all political calculus, right?
definitely.
You know, the political calculus just got pushed so far one direction, right, that she had to jump off. But it is kind of interesting. I mean, because basically, like, it is that Ed Murray just, you know, he was not having the approved sex, right? You know, right? Like, you know, in some ways, you know,
Right.
yeah. Not to say that he should have been like molesting his cousin, but
No,
like,
absolutely not.
but
Definitely not. But yeah, yeah, exactly.
But that to me seems like the crux of sex blindness for the liberal is that it is okay to be gay as long as I don't know that you're gay.
Exactly.
Or at least I theoretically could not know.
Right. Yeah. I don't have to know the details. I don't have to know anything
Or
about
that
your sex life.
you
Or the reality
offer
of your sex life.
this flattery to white middle class heteronormativity by emulating it, you know.
At the same time, just like we see with color blindness, it's not really, it's a selective blindness.
Right.
Because at the same time, you're touting this as a gay-tolerant city. Same as, you know, George H.W. Bush rolls out Clarence Thomas. You know?
Yeah.
Well, and what do you think? And maybe this is like too big a question, but
And George W. Bush had the most diverse cabinet of any president we've ever had.
which is why he was such a great president.
So you know,
Representation.
This is actually a pro GW.
yeah. So, you know, he was very color aware in a way to try to rewrite the script on his own racist politics.
Well, apparently amongst, you know, self-identified Democratic liberals has like a 70% approval rating now too.
Oh, yeah.
So I guess, you know, he did it right. But
That tells you something.
well, yeah, that tells you something about the Democrat. It tells you all you need to know about the Democratic Party. But the this idea though of like the sort of heteronormativity and this idea of this like idealized family structure, and like I said, maybe this is too big a question, but it's like, what's with the obsession with that? like why does it fucking matter? Like who cares that like somebody is fucking a dude in a park at 2 a.m. Like, you know, what are you doing? You know,
So
is that impeding on anybody's life?
You know, this has a long history that really goes back to the progressive era of the white middle class asserting itself politically, both by reining in corporations who've just taken their own labor away from them, essentially, and policing working class behavior, including prostitution. Washington's sodomy law is only passed in 1893. It was not passed it was passed soon after it became a state, but and 1893 is, of course, right before the Alaska-Yukon Gold Rush. And Seattle was like, also, by the way, 10 men for every woman back then. So
there was a lot of celibacy.
Not unlike today. Right?
Yeah.
It was the same ratio of men in podcasting.
Yeah, so there's definitely this anxiety and by the powerful and perhaps by places in Washington that are not Seattle that, Seattle is this like Sodom and Gomorrah place
Mm-hmm.
that needs to be reined in.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, if you're, sort of, an itinerant laborer in Seattle, maybe living down in, like, the Skid Road area, presumably there's lots of male prostitutes, too, along with female prostitutes, like having sex with men in Skid Road. I mean, is there even a concept at the time of, like, hardline, you're gay, you're straight?
No. I mean, George Chauncey's book on New York City during this time is fantastic. Gay New York, if you feel compelled to read it. But, no. So there's, the word homosexual doesn't enter the English language until 1895, and that's in a scientific context. As George Chauncey argues, the social identity doesn't fully crystallize really until 1930. And that it's as if you are the penetrative partner, there's really no anxiety about who you have sex with at all, especially among a lot of working class Europeans, of which there were many. In Seattle was very much a Nordic town, and so people would have a certain identity associated with them if they were a receptive sexual partner, and which many of the male prostitutes were, but who you had sex with wasn't like foundational to your identity in 1893. It was still called sodomy, and the word sodomy isn't even used in the law. It's simply called crime against nature, and it was assumed that you knew what that meant.
Yeah.
That's pretty broad, though.
Yeah.
Well,
Poor Dr. Frankenstein.
Yeah.
To bring it back to the present, like, so what? Okay, so the gay politics that's won out here is this, like you say, heteronormative, sex-blind thing. Like, I mean, isn't that good? Who's the victim here?
So, excuse me. So this this continues to allow the exclusion of a lot of other people. So people who are polyamorous, people who don't want to marry anyone, people who just do not have that lifestyle, and especially with the way that certain rights are conferred in this country based on your marital status, it becomes it's an institution that the state incentivizes in many ways, rather than, and it continues this social reproduction that reproduces this consumptive heteronormative society that we live in.
If you're middle class, if you're on that track, family, kids, you're gonna have to have jobs. You're gonna want to buy a house and cars. So you're really not challenging the basic structure of our society or of the power of capital in anything but this sort of, when you strip it down to just this heteronormative, sex-blind version, white middle-class version of homosexuality, all you're really challenging is this kind of vague social, sexual mores, and nothing else about the real power structure of society. So
correct.
It's like,
it's inclusion in society
why not?
as it exists, without changing any of the basic underlying premises of the society that we live in.
And so if you're willing to do that, to buy into the real things that really matter at the end of the day, you're willing or able, then you're included. But if you're not willing or, really able, because a lot of this is economic, I think, then you're shit out of luck. That's what it seems like.
And so maybe going back in time a little bit to illuminate how this plays out a little bit in Seattle is this 1978 like sort of initiative battle, because we have this slightly moronic referendum system in Washington, where there's two initiatives, an initiative 13, initiative 15. Mm-hmm. One about discrimination against, I assume at this point, just gay and lesbian people in housing. And another initiative that says cops can actually take flamethrowers to children. And so maybe you could tell us a little about how it got to there and how that played out, and maybe that would be illuminating.
Sure, yeah. So 1978. Starting in the fall of 1977, Anita Bryant had started her anti-gay crusade in Miami-Dade County.
Wonderful orange juice.
Starting in Miami-Dade County and then in a few other cities, and then at least one of them was Mormon. Two cops from Seattle, Dennis Falk and David Estes, introduced a similar initiative here in Seattle that would strip away those housing and employment protections that were passed in 73 and 75.
So, two police officers, to be clear, two of our hallowed guardian protectors, the real troops,
as we call them here,
put forward a referendum, or got a referendum on the ballot, that the rights of lesbian gay people didn't have to be. That basically, if your landlord found out you were gay, he could throw your ass out.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Long and the short of it, right?
Exactly, and that was, the crux of this. I mean, it's NIMBY bullshit, right? Yeah. It's
and these two cops, very clean records, didn't do anything crazy. No, weird shit on them, right? They're pretty good.
No, so one of them had already had a history of overstepping. But while the campaign was unfolding, so let me talk about Initiative 15 also, because it'll give it's important here. So the state of Washington had recently passed a law that gave cops basically immunity to murder people. They could use firearms at their own discretion. Regardless, they were not really limited by much of anything. So the mayor of Seattle at the time, Charles Royer, thought this was ridiculous, and city council passed, and he signed a law to rein that in. So cops could only use their firearms if they believed that a suspect was running away from a crime scene and had a gun, or if they were actually being attacked. And this was then put up to a referendum by the voters. So Initiative 13 was this anti-gay initiative. Initiative 15 was this war on crime, cops should be allowed to shoot people whenever they want kind of bill initiative. Naturally the Seattle Police Department was all in favor of that.
Yeah.
So as this campaign is unfolding, one of the two cops shoots an unarmed black man who's 26 years old, John Alfred Rodney, and he also had mental health issues. And this becomes a moment where so there were really two camps pushing the anti-13 campaign. So there was...
Well, it's not just anybody that shoots this man, right?
Oh, it's the guy who fucking wrote
it's Falk,
who wrote
right?
Initiative 13. Yeah, exactly.
And this was a non-violent crime too,
Yes, yeah. And so and he, as I mentioned, Falk had already had a history of overstepping.
Yeah.
Which the state of Washington basically gave him liberty to do that, but I don't think Royer's Law had gone into effect yet.
Yeah, he got in under the wire, right?
Yeah,
I mean, according to your dissertation, he got that murder in 2 weeks before the
Squeak that one in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there were two groups fighting against Initiative 13, very much in line with what we've been talking about. The more homonormative, respectability politics group was Citizens to Retain Fair Employment, which very purposefully kept any references to being gay out of the name of their organization, and really kept gay out of the fight in general. It was very much about how this was infringing on a universal right to privacy, that if you were allowed to be fired for being gay, that would mean that people could, peer in through your window and see what you're doing off the job. And then there was the Seattle Committee Against 13, or SCAT, creatively, creative name there. And then they had an organization, Women Against 13, that formed and decided they needed their own group. Because Initiative 13 also came after protections for women. Mm-hmm. And the Scat and Watt crew were generally the gay liberation folks. Younger, more radical, more intersectional. And after that shooting, they did a lot to pair 15 and 13 together, which was very easy to do, since the man who wrote 13 had just shot an unarmed person. And so there was a lot of coalitional activism around these two initiatives, and in fact, when the votes came down, so Initiative 13 did fail, so Seattle's reputation for being gay tolerant was reified by this election. At the same time, and by a 2-1 margin, by the way, at the same time that Initiative 15 passed by a 2-1 margin. So a third of Seattleites basically said gay is okay, but cops should be able to use their guns whenever they want.
Yeah.
However, thinking about the third that was, on the social justice side of both of these issues, the Central District, which was predominantly black at that time, voted more against 13 than Capitol Hill did, which is the neighborhood that we all think of as the gay one, which in 78 it's moving in that direction, but still...
So maybe a neighborhood of people who could imagine being discriminated against in housing.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that was an argument that Scott was saying, was this is a slippery slope. If they take away our rights, what's going to stop them from coming after yours?
Yeah. Well, and so the city basically spoke up, right, and was like, when it comes to a gay community that we're seeing as increasingly respectable, so long as they act in particular ways, we're okay with. But I mean, how would you see this policing violence law other than keeping the Central District in line, right? So for certain people who are never going to be acceptable, right?
Mm-hmm. And it's also worth noting that also in this election, Seattleites voted to overturn their busing system to achieve integration in public schools as well.
Oh, what an unheard of thing outside of the South.
Definitely not in Boston.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. But yeah, it happened here too. And same election. All the three of those things were the same election. So really this election, in my mind, represents a supplanting of racial liberalism with sexual liberalism. And Seattle never really looks back.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, this is this sort of hinge moment in American politics, the sort of right-wing backlash, the coming Reagan revolution, There's also big, backlashes against just basic women's rights, equal opportunity stuff. This time,
Phyllis Schlafly is kicking real hard right at this exact moment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. She's launching a crusade at the same time. And it's interesting that as the country took this right-wing turn, like, it seems like in this form that you're describing, gay rights of a kind, like, managed to, like, slip through, to contort itself, to, like, find its way through that kink in, like, our politics, and come out on the other side, like, still moving forward.
Certainly in Seattle, that's true. You definitely do see a backlash. In the late 70s, the presumption was, for all these groups, feminists, gay folks, there was this real sense that things were improving. And there was almost an air of inevitability. There were even over 50 politicians, not necessarily Democrats, because the two parties hadn't fully crystallized around these social issues yet, who were... There were gay politics bills happening in Congress that were getting, not close to a majority of support, but certainly a critical mass of support.
And you could feel like maybe shortly.
It's just a matter of time, right?
Yeah.
And then after Reagan got elected, and then after AIDS hit, the public opinion polling about attitudes toward homosexuality just plummet.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean the AIDS anxiety is very, very real, but the culture of Reaganism adds fuel to that fire.
Yeah. So to bring it back to the beginning of the interview and the idea of the Pride Parade in 2017, right? There was not just the issue of the counter-protest trying to maybe reclaim some of the politics of Pride, but there was another issue a little bit prior to that, right? Maybe between some of the sponsors.
Yeah, so that was 2016.
Oh, 2016,
Pride.
okay,
yeah,
my bad.
Pride... So first off, after it was a march downtown, it was then... It went through a few years where the fighting between the sex-blind, homonormative politics and gay liberation politics really came to a head. So, the Dorian Group, which was a moderate gay rights organization, claimed ownership over the Pride. It had been organized throughout the 70s by this group called the Stonewall Committee, which generally were gay liberationists and lesbian feminists. And they moved it to Capitol Hill as a means of making it more of a community celebration or parade as opposed to a march.
What year is this?
This is 1980.
So instead of marching and yelling at the non-converted, now we're just parading in the neighborhood.
Right.
So to what degree at this point, I'm curious, had the gay community or the epicenter of gay Seattle moved up the hill?
Yeah, so the Hill was home to gay people before the bars moved there. In the late 1960s, you both had the construction of the 520 bridge to the east side and the Boeing bust. So you just had people leaving Capitol Hill. You had big, wealthy Catholic families moving to the suburbs and people just leaving the Seattle area entirely. So Capitol Hill became very, very inexpensive. And there were a lot of big homes there that became group homes for gay liberationist families.
These mansions.
Yeah, and hippies and artists as well.
Yeah.
That's how Capitol Hill got the reputation that it has. Doesn't really apply anymore. But so there was And it was in the late 70s that the first bars started opening, and gay bar owners started opening them there because they're like, this is where the gay people are. It's not like we have housing protections, we have employment protections. We don't need to be going to Pioneer Square to go out. And, you could perhaps read a little bit of racism into that too, if it's bringing it away from this very marginalized neighborhood to one that, Capitol Hill was still pretty. In fact, a 1968 community survey made very clear that the biggest fear of people in the neighborhood was that black people were moving in. So,
So they're moving away. It's moving away from Pioneer Square, which is racially diverse, into a more like mansion-y neighborhood.
Not entirely. So, the west slope of Capitol Hill is apartment housing. It's not, it's, very...
But a different vibe.
Yeah.
And it's attracting businesses and bars and nightlife because there's, like, a scene of people living there. So it seems like it's like white flight and gentrification, like, happening at the same moment.
Yes, absolutely.
I guess from one I guess from one place to another. But.
Absolutely. Yeah, the neighborhood is changing very rapidly. And the seeds of gentrification are planted, and as I write in my dissertation, gay bar owners play a role in that, and of course they do, right?
Yeah.
Any flourishing business is going to make a neighborhood more attractive. And that is very much part of the process of gentrification on a systemic level.
Yeah, one will create a internal interest in their own rising property values and things too, right? To keep the ball rolling, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And so in 1981, the Stonewall Committee moved the parade back to downtown. The following year, this new organization, the Greater Seattle Business Association, which is a gay business association that purposefully doesn't have gay in it. Though they have a G in it, but the
subtlest of subtleties.
Yeah, they proclaimed themselves the leader of the parade, which the Stonewall Committee was understandably pissed about. And one of my sources talks about... refers to GSBA as self-appointed leaders.
So this is like a little just like Capitol takeover. They basically enclosed the gay community. Right? It's like Capitol enclosure, stealing the fucking event.
There was.
It sounds like the chamber types coming.
It is, and that's exactly. And GSBA, by the way, today is the largest gay business association in the country, and it includes allies. So, like Linda Dershang was their businesswoman of the year a couple of years ago.
Legendarily cool.
Who is not gay, not anything in the LGBTQ plus umbrella. And I got sidetracked. Where was I going?
That'll happen on this show.
Yeah. But so the GSBS basically has had a hostile takeover of the march, right? And the people from the Stonewall Committee are not thrilled.
Yes.
And they just happen to be marching them past their businesses, right? Exactly. Past their business.
Exactly.
Just in case you want to stop and buy something.
No, and that's the reasoning behind this. They're transparent about this.
Those marchers and paraders are going to be thirsty.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
So they move the parade back up to the hill. A few years later, the Broadway Business Improvement Association becomes the first business improvement district in Seattle, and from all of the research I did, there's a chance that it might be the first in the United States.
Wow. Interesting.
Toronto had them prior to that, but I haven't yet tracked down one in the U.S. before this one.
Do we know if the Toronto one was Drake related?
Pretty sure Drake wasn't alive then, but yeah, so Anyways, so the parade's on the hill for a number of years, and it really becomes a community event, and one in which gay businesses are the main profiteers. It is like fucking Christmas on Broadway every June. And then in 2006, they make a decision to move the parade back downtown for a very different reason than before, but it's because the city wants like to portray itself as
prestige.
embracing this community.
So this is 2006, you said?
Yeah.
Do you think this is just a shot in the dark here? Is this basic? Because George W. Bush has to have like rock bottom.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
approval
this
at
is
point.
like post Katrina. Iraq is not going well. Yeah.
And so this is some like bullshit like that doesn't actually help in any way, like stab in the eye of
like the rainbow,
George W. Bush,
the
I
rainbow
guess.
crosswalks we have now. And,
Or from that time. Interesting.
Oh no, those are from
Oh.
Ed Murray's time as mayor.
Yeah.
Right, but yeah, this is, that's the midterm election a few months later, 5 months later, that, finally, like, the tide turned against the Republicans.
Yeah. Yeah, when he's
everyone was out of their seat against,
well, when we knew that the Republican Party would no longer live past 2008.
Yeah, elections
die
have
as
consequences,
a party.
remember?
Yeah, exactly. Would die as a
There'd
party.
never be another Republican president again.
Exactly. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It was an exciting time.
So 2006, they brought it downtown. So what does the parade look like then at that point?
And that's when it starts becoming corporatized.
Mm-hmm.
And today, so in the 2016 situation is just so funny. So, so the organizers of the parade gave Delta the highest level of sponsorship for the parade. Like there's tiers of sponsorship.
Yeah, fuck yeah. So at this point, is the GSBA just like kind of written out of this? So like the major brands have won and GSBA's on the sideline, or?
Well, I mean now there's probably businesses on 4th Avenue that are GSBA.
Yeah.
That are not gay owned.
Yeah,
but
are like in this
have a
loose
window
association.
sticker.
Yeah, and I mean GSBA
Yeah.
is still a sponsor.
But they're not gonna have. They're not. Their pride of place is being pushed aside
Right.
from the major corporations, right? It's like Delta. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So yes, it's less of a buy gay kind of message and more a buy corporate people who like gays.
Yeah, or at least are gonna tell you that while you purchase things.
So anyways, so obviously Alaska Airlines is based here in Seattle, and Delta was granted this sponsorship, and Alaska was told that they couldn't march in the parade, and gay Alaska
So
employees
cool.
lost their fucking minds, and
They
ultimately
had to represent for their
Airline wars.
employer.
Yeah, ultimately they were allowed to march in it. But there was like an effort to boycott the parade, like
Unpaid free advertisement just on the employees on behalf, like.
yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
So all
Well,
of
this
this
is like in the 19th century when the competing firehouses would fist fight outside the fire, right? It's like that. Like the competing airlines are gonna fist fight for this chance to walk for free and advertise a company that's probably fucking you in your pay. But
Yeah.
So and ultimately the person in charge who made that decision quit the next day. But
So
but yeah,
funny.
just the perfect story to highlight like how corporate this parade is these days, and what that says about gay politics in the this decade.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a process that really begins in the 90s. You start getting a lot more portrayal of gays in national media, not just at the local level. And a lot of it is in that normalizing vein. Think Will and Grace. We have, RuPaul now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, RuPaul really was around then, too, but RuPaul's Drag Race really takes it to another level.
We talked about this before we started, but we have been asking this, positing this question about, like, when did Seattle become progressive Seattle? And this has made me think, I didn't want it to be this, and I think this is the most horrifying realization, and that it's like, but is it possible? Like, we'll come up with many theories here, but the one that I think has come out of this for me is that it's, like, peak Bush administration backlash, like, way too late.
Yeah, caring when it matters least.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, like, when the war's going bad, like, yeah, can it possibly be that dark? Like,
I thought that's what we said last time we asked this
What?
question. It was
I
post
think
2001.
We had speculated maybe like the WTO in '99 was like the start of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which I then said was all outside agitators.
Yeah,
which I think got some pushback.
yeah, exactly. I mean, that's legit. Like, this, we're trying to identify this other thing.
But this is also progressive in scare quotes, right?
Well, this
Yeah,
is progressive, I think, the way liberals see it, right? Which I
Right.
think
Well,
in your
and
story,
let's-
Kevin, is
Let's
like...
not
that makes
forget
sense.
that Seattle hosted the WTO
Right.
in
Yeah.
1999.
And liberals in
Yeah.
Seattle were not thrilled about the anti-WTO protests,
No,
right?
yeah.
Of course not.
So I mean, I think they got upset about how bad the city looked in the response to it, but they certainly weren't like happy that these groups that they didn't like were marching. I don't know. Liberal Seattle has like deep love for like steel workers and the IAM,
Right.
or like radical environmentalists, that were also there, right? But maybe 2006. Maybe that's our moment. Maybe that was like a Caesar, marching through Rome of total liberal victory in Seattle. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly point to 1973 as with the employment ordinance as Seattle setting it apart from
Mhm.
the rest of I mean, actually, Michigan was at the forefront. Ann Arbor and I think a few college towns in Michigan were the first to really do it, but Seattle was the first
Major city. Yeah.
And and it depends what we mean by liberal here too. But
Yeah.
you certainly have, starting with Wes Ullman, a series with Royer, Norm Rice, a series of mayors that are liberal,
Yeah.
but that's a relative term, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Liberal in affectation and presentation, but when it comes to protecting property values.
Yeah, and that's what we're talking about. This neoliberal hegemony that is adorns itself with these certain progressive signifiers.
That are co-ops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right, and that's basically what my dissertation is all about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe any final thoughts on the state of Seattle and Seattle liberalism?
Oh God. Will any of us be able to afford to live here and tell the end story?
Oh, I feel like I know the answer to that is no.
Well,
there is a housing affordability portal that is potentially being built by the
Oh,
city.
yeah.
So
Mhm.
eventually we'll be able to look on there and know that there is nothing.
well, should we pick this up in a Patreon episode then?
Yep.
Stay tuned. Put this
Yeah.
one out first, and then do a quick and try. Like, maybe we'll do something shorter.
All right, so should we say bye to the freeloaders?
Yeah. Goodbye, freeloaders. Suckers, tune in for a further discussion about sort of the present moment and where this has all taken us.
And before we go, was there anything that you maybe wanted to plug or mention? Can people follow you?
Plug going to high school.
Would you like us to share your dissertation?
No, I mean, I'm this summer I'm hoping to get more of a handle on. I'm presenting at that conference in San Francisco, and we'll see if that ignites a spark for me to actually do more with this than let it sit in ProQuest dissertations. But yeah.
You're here first. Go to ProQuest dissertations, guys. Look up Kevin McKenna.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for being on the show. This was really awesome. I appreciate you taking the time. And before we go, I guess we have one new Patreon subscriber. Keeping the streak alive. So thank you, Kristen Mayer. You rock. And if you want to be like Kristen, you can find us on Patreon. So, all right. That's it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Bye.
Bye.
All right.